Welcome to the Linguleum. I'm going to talk about wonderful things to do instead of prepositions. Many languages use what is called prepositions. In English, we have around 150 of them, for example, in, by, with, but also more complex ones like according to, because of, or in spite of. In German, we have an interesting feature where we translate the two prepositions in, as in the house, and into, as in into the house, with the same preposition. So in English we have different prepositions, but in German we say in dem Haus and in das Haus. And the direction is not encoded in the preposition in, but in the case of the article. Dem is dative and das is accusative. And this feature inspired me to create a new system which doesn't use adpositions at all, but only what could be roughly called cases. So for example, in Finnish we have about 15 cases, many of which, or most of which, encode location as well as direction. And I basically combined this with what we do in German and created a three-layered case system. These three layers I call the case layer, the proximity layer, and the location layer. I'm going to explain later what those terms exactly mean. And every layer is marked by a suffix, and the layers can be combined. The case layer is always present because the nominative in the case layer has a no suffix, so if it appears like only the proximity or only the location layer is present, it's actually the nominative in the case layer, so the case layer is always marked. And this is why the first combination possibility is just case, so we can have only the case, which is your basic non-spatial cases like nominative, genitive, dative, etc. I'm going to show those in a minute. Then we have the combination case and proximity, which is basically all the non-spatial cases you can imagine. Like I went through lists of cases in natural languages and basically dumped all in this system. So we have 6 cases and 5 proximities, which yields 30 cases, 30 detailed non-spatial cases. Then we have the combination case and location without the proximity layer, which is your basic locations and directions, like in, into, from, etc. And then we have the combination of all 3, case, proximity, and location. And this is basically all the spatial relations you need to express in a language. Let's start with the case layer. On the case layer, we have 6 cases, as I said. The nominative, which is unmarked, so huel is just a house as a subject. Then we have the genitive, hueli, as of a house, and more specifically, unalienable possessive, but I'm going to explain later what this means. Then we have the dative, huelan, for a house, and the accusative, huelin, a house as an object. And those are basically the 4 cases we have in German, but I added 2 more. Commentative, huelas, along with a house or just with a house. And finally, the adjective, huelis, which could be translated as a house or just a house in a sentence like this is a house, because it's the case of what is and what is identity. But this is only the beginning, right? Because we have 2 more layers and those 6 cases behave very differently in the other layers. So let's look at the combination of the proximity layer and the case layer next. And I'm going to show the combination of proximity layer and nominative first. So, in the proximity layer we have 5 proximities and the empty proximity. So, no marking of proximity, which would in this case just be the nominative, well, so a house as a subject. And then we have the first real proximity, which I call tangential, which is about whether something touches something else, and this is only going to be relevant for the location layer. And of course, Walib, all those forms are just random forms and they are not supposed to be particularly beautiful. They're just for demonstration purposes. So tangential plus nominative means a house as a packative subject, which is a kind of case which is present in some languages, or at least hypothesized to be, and it's basically the subject of a giving. So if I give something to you, it would be in the packative. Then we have the proximal, Huelig, which encodes the agent of a passive. So for example, in it was hidden by a house would be in the nominative proximal. And then we have the distal, Huelid, which would mean despite the house. Then we have the absential, Huelin, which marks the subject of a passive. So Huelin would be a house or the house in the sentence, the house was hidden by trees. And finally we have the temporal proximity, Huelem, which only really works with nouns that mean something with time. And so let's imagine Huel has a metaphorical extension and could also mean visit. So Huelem would mean at the time of the visit. So generally, nominative plus temporal means at the time of something. Right. You might have noticed that I'm a bit inconsistent with the articles. So sometimes it's a house, sometimes it's the house. And this is just because, for example, despite the house is perhaps more common than despite a house. It doesn't really matter for the point I'm trying to make. Let's just imagine this is a language that doesn't mark definiteness at all, and only through context and perhaps case combinations. So, but we have still 5 cases to go, and I'm not going to go through them as detailed as through the nominative. So just to those that are a bit less self-explanatory, I'm going to say a few words. Let's start with the genitive. So here we have the unalienable possessive in the empty proximity and the alienable possessive in the tangential proximity. And this is something that is marked in some languages, and it's basically the difference between my parent, which can't not be my parent anymore, right? It can't give you my parent and then it's your parent suddenly. Or my leg, it will always be my leg, will always be an integral part of me, even if I somehow remove it from my body. And then in the alienable possessive, as opposed to this, we have things like my bike or my pen, which I can sell or give to someone else, and then it is their bike or their pen, right? So it can change the owner, it can change the person it belongs to. And we can mark this with a difference in the proximity layer. In the dative, the only thing that might not be self-explanatory is what I mean by excluding in the temporal proximity. So, for example, if we have the sentence, we don't see each other until the visit, this implies that we are going to see each other when the visit happens. So the visit is excluded from the until, right? As opposed to the including until in the accusative plus temporal. So I couldn't really come up with a good example for visit, but imagine deadlines. I'm not sure whether this is just as big a problem as it is in German. In German, we always have to differentiate between whether we mean until including or until excluding. So, for example, if your professor tells you, please hand in the paper until Tuesday, it wouldn't be clear if they mean you still have time on Tuesday to hand in the paper, or whether they mean you have to hand it in on Monday at the very latest. And in this language we can differentiate between those two very easily, and this is very helpful, I think. Then we have the commentative, which I think is pretty self-explanatory, as well as the essive. So let's move on to the location layer. We have not 6 but 12 locations, and they are above, below, before, behind, inside, outside, between and around, by or next to, and opposite, and finally to the left of and to the right of. And you could come up perhaps with more locations that you could need, but I couldn't think of any more, and I think you can get quite a long way with these, and in combination, of course, with the case layer and the proximity layer, because you might have noticed they don't say anything about direction, right? And direction is going to be encoded by the case layer. So let's take by or next to as an example and combine it with the 6 cases and leave out the proximity layer for now. So in the nominative, this ending just means by or next to as a stative position in relation to something else. So huelen would mean by the house, and it's basically what is expressed by the locative in languages like Finnish or Turkish. Then we have the genitive, huelien, away from the house or just from the house. It's equivalent to the ablative in many languages. Then the dative, to the house, huelenen, it's equivalent to the adlative. And this, you could think, are the basic directionalities you need, right? So most languages that encode directionality in the cases only use the locative, the allative, and the ablative in some variations. So for example, Turkish, right? It only has ablative, allative, and locative. No, it doesn't have allative, it is called dative, but you know what I mean. And there are 3 more directionalities that I think are important, perhaps less important than those basic 3, but they, of course, can be expressed by the other 3 cases that are left. So we have the accusative, huelinen, past the house, which contrasts with the commentative, huelassen, along the house. But we have a dynamic along the house, so we move along the house. And in contrast to the accusative, we don't have any indication that the entity passes the house, right? So a better example might be walking along the road, right? Because we don't pass the road. We don't say we're passing the road when we walk along the road. And this contrasts with the essive as well, which we would express with along as well, but it's a static along. So the ladder is lying along the house. We would probably not say that in English. We would perhaps say the ladder is lying next to the house or behind the house, but it is covering one side of the house, right? It is not just in one place, but it implies that it is covering a whole stretch of one side of the house. A better example would probably be there are trees along the road, because this you would say, and the trees don't move, so it's not commutative, but they are standing still, and they are not just next to the road, because this would probably imply more like a bunch of trees in one location next to the road, but then there's a whole stretch of the road which is not lined by trees, but the trees line the whole road, so that they are standing along the road. Or people are standing along the road, cheering, or something like that. And this would be expressed with the asif. Right, and now I'm going to give 6 more examples, also with the proximity layer involved, to give an insight into how much you can really express with this system. So the first example, huelai, means in the house, and in the case layer we have the nominative, which is empty, right? It has no suffix, and the proximity layer is empty because we don't have any information about whether it touches the house, or because usually if something is in the house, we don't say anything about that, right? And then we have, of course, in the location layer, inside, right? So those 3 combined would mean in the house. The second example is a bit more complex. Hueliba, down from on top of the house. We have the genitive because we have a movement away from something, right? From on top of the house. And we have the tangential proximity because it is from on top, right? It is from, it moves from touching the upper side of the house, or the roof of the house probably. So this means, of course, we have the above in the location layer, and those 3 combined would mean down from on top of, right? Then we have huelango, behind the house, as in go behind the house. So we have a moving towards something, which is expressed by the dative. We have the proximal proximity, because we don't touch the house, but we are not far from the house either. The proximal could be omitted in most cases. In this case, I just included it to demonstrate what it means. And of course, because we move behind the house, we have the location behind. Next, huelindes, passing the house on the left with distance. This is perhaps easier imaginable with an example. So imagine you're giving someone directions and you're in the countryside and there are fields everywhere, and then there's a house on the right side of the road, but the house, between the house and the road there is a field, right? And you're telling the person you need to pass this house, right? But there's a field, so there's a distance between you and the house. And you're passing the house, of course, on the left because it is to your right. And we have the accusative in the case layer because we are passing something. And then we have the distal proximity because there's a distance because of the field, right? And then we have the location to the left. The next example is a bit more of a stretch, but it is there to demonstrate what the system can do, what nuances we can express, and what extensions we can express. So, huelasno would mean through the neighborhood, and but more literally, it would mean around the house, but with the house not really in reach, right? So we have the commutative because we are moving along something, moving along or moving around, right? Because we have on the location layer we have around, so around plus commutative means moving around something. And then we have the absential proximity, which basically means that the house is not really perhaps in sight, so we can't see the house, or the house is so far off because there's so much in between that it doesn't really, it's not really about the house as such. So, and the combination of all three of these would mean through the neighborhood of the house, or perhaps more literally, around the house with much distance. And finally, we have velismun at the same time as the visit. Of course, we have the temporal proximity and the asif, because it is something that is basically parallel to the visit, right? It is as the ladder next to the house, it is next to the visit, but it is not during the visit. So during the visit something happened would imply that it has some effect on the visit, but because we have on the location layer the opposite location, it is implied that it is at least has the same stretch, but it is also very probably in another location. Of course, in combination with the temporal proximity layer, the location layer has also a temporal meaning, but this is a metaphorical extension, right? Because many languages have location as the basic non-metaphorical meaning, and then this is metaphorically extended to also include temporal meanings, and in this case we have a temporal meaning of opposite. And we could, of course, then think of more metaphorical extensions, right? So, for example, under a certain amount. This is not under as in under the table, but under an abstract amount, right? So under has a metaphorical extension meaning less than. And it could still be expressed with the same location below, right? But we can do more with a system that is not directly implied by anything that I have shown so far. So, for example, how about light verb constructions? So, light verb constructions in English, for example, we have to take a shower, as opposed to just to shower. To shower, we have one verb that expresses the whole action, and in to take a shower, we have a verb to take, which doesn't really have so much meaning in this case, and we have the noun, which gives the whole phrase its central meaning, right? And we can do a lot with light verbs and the different cases we have, especially without the location layer. So just the proximity layer and the case layer. For example, to consider, we could translate as to take plus accusative plus distal, because accusative plus distal was the distal proximity. We have considering the house, right? So I'm going to give an example right up in the next idea, which is gerund constructions. A gerund is a verb that takes on several syntactic functions of a noun, but also retains verbal functions. So it can take an object, for example, but it also can be an object. So we have the sentence, I'm considering buying a house, and buying is a gerund because it has an object, so it's a verb, but it also is an object of considering. And you also see we have to consider as the verb, so I'm going to give an example of the light verb construction. So I'm considering buying a house translates as Gare huerin massa find. And gare basically is take in the present indicative first person singular, then the house, because it is the object of buying, is in the accusative, huelin, and then we have Massefind. The F marks it as a gerund. It is attached to the verb stem Masse, and then attached to the F we have the case and the proximity, which is accusative and distal. As I said before, this in combination with the light verb to take would mean to consider, right? I consider buying a house. So it's a very different make-up of this meaning of the sentence, I'm considering buying a house, in this hypothetical language. Then another idea we can do with the system is contractions of very common phrases, like if für means tomorrow and voranem means until tomorrow, so as in we see each other tomorrow, which is very common in German. Voranem could be contracted to füram because it is just often used, and the am suffix is not used yet in this system, right? So we can just have anem be contracted to am. And then we can imagine different ways of marking, right? So instead of attaching suffixes, we could modify the root, which is called non-concatenative morphology. So in English, for example, we have sing, sang, sang, and in this language we could do huel, huil, hual, hual, hul, huil, for example, to have the 6 different cases, and then attach perhaps suffixes or have 2 syllables in the nominative, and have in the second syllable modify another vowel for the proximity layer, etc. So there are just different ways of encoding those different layers, right? We could also imagine not having a location layer in the noun, but have a separate adposition, or like preposition or postposition, and have this take all the functions of the location layer and then combine this with a 2-dimensional case system with the case layer and the proximity layer, which is marked in the noun. And finally, something else we could consider is not only replacing adpositions but also conjunctions, right? Because we have the gerund constructions, we could use the different case combinations, case and proximity combinations, to encode the different conjunction meanings. So for example, I came inside because it is too cold outside. So in this because, we had a combination of proximity and case, which meant because of, and we can now say leven huelanai as varfe galau, which would mean come in the preterite and with the first person singular. Leven. Then we have inside or into the house, right? I just used the where we already had, and with dative it means into the house. And then we have the adjective as varefähig, which is in this case a verb, and we have too cold, so it's the accessive as varefähig, too cold. This is based on an idea I presented in an earlier video. And then we have ware, which just means cold, so as ware would be too cold or is too cold. And then we have the gerund marker again, because we want to combine this with the case and proximity genitive plus proximal, because this combination is the because of combination. So aswartefähig means because it is too cold. And finally, allow is just this plus nominative plus outside. This is just the demonstrative with, so all with the outside location to mean outside. And this whole sentence, Leven Helena es waterfähige Lau, would translate as I came into the house because of its being too cold outside. So this would be the more direct translation. Yeah, and this is many different things you can do instead of prepositions, instead of having all those nuances expressed in very different and perhaps awkward ways with adpositions and adverbs, perhaps partially. And I'm sure there are more ways you could extend this system. So if you have any ideas, just leave them in the comments. I'm very curious to read them. Yeah, and until next time, lots of love.